Hello everyone, I'm Chad. This is IntraWeb 17, IntraWeb Markup language. Take 1 versus take 2. We did a similar presentation a few days ago. Unfortunately, we had a problem with the audio which cut off at the 15-minute mark and left the last half without any audio. We've resolved that problem and we were just going to simply re-record the video, but based on feedback we made quite a few changes. So this is not the same presentation as before. It does have some of the same content, but we've moved into live videos well beyond just the screenshots we had before, and a lot of the material is moved to a separate video which we released yesterday called IntraWeb 15 to 17 Roadmaps, and that's on YouTube. If you haven't seen that yet, I would strongly suggest you watch that first, or at least watch it after, because it'll fill in some of the holes you may have from watching this presentation. IntraWeb 17, in this presentation we're only going to focus on IWML, which is the core feature. If you want to hear anything about the other features, then you need to check the other presentation which I referenced in the previous slide. The full roadmap is at this URL, and the video that I spoke about is also at the second URL. The second URL for YouTube is also linked at the roadmap above. So the overview, what we're going to talk about today is a really very early preview. There's no Delphi code to show yet, and this might sound strange, but Delphi is the easiest part of 17 because the initial code for 17 is largely the same as 16 with just integration of IWML. So that code is much, much smaller. The majority of our work is in what's called IWCL, and this used to be written in JavaScript, but now it's in TypeScript, and that's where the majority of our work is going right now. So I'm going to show you some TypeScript code in a demo, but the eventual promise of IntraWeb 17 is that you'll be able to write all of that in Delphi. You won't have to write TypeScript. But I want to show you how easy the TypeScript is too, because you can do a lot of things in the client by writing the TypeScript, whereas in the older versions of IntraWeb you had to use JavaScript, which is much uglier and much, much harder to use because it doesn't have a component level IWCL like 17 does. The visuals are not pretty yet. The focus right now is solely on the framework and the proof of concept. We have not gotten to templates or styling or anything of those sorts. Of course you can use CSS, that works just fine, but we do have plans around templates and styling, but we're just not to that point yet. Now I also want to be very clear to set your expectations. If you can see the vision where we're going and you can understand that what I'm showing you are the very, very early steps, I think you'll be wowed. If you can't see the vision, you might be disappointed. If that's the case, you've just come too early. You need to keep watching and watch where we're going and see as we get more controls. Right now, for instance, the controls that have been written in the new system, there are less than a dozen of them that are in the system yet, and they're not complete yet. We have buttons and edits and labels and different layouts and things. And the next step after this presentation is we're going to work on porting the rest of the controls as well as adding a lot of new controls. So IWML stands for the IntraWeb Markup language. And here's a very simple sample of some IWML you can see here. We're going to be going through this shortly. Now the Delphi Designer, in IntraWeb 17, it will be very much like IntraWeb is today. Within Delphi, you'll be able to take a page or a form, depending on how you prefer to call them, and just drag and drop your controls, set the properties, and go. And just as Delphi updates the DFM as you do this by itself, it will update what's called an IWML file for you instead. This RAD experience is not there yet. It will be there before release, but again, we're still in the very early stages. But it'll look something along the lines of this. So here's your page, and just as in a normal Delphi application or a normal IntraWeb application, you can look at the DFM if you want. In this case, instead of a DFM, you'll have an IWMM file. And it looks like this. So the idea is you're able to switch back and forth in Delphi, drag and drop, set your properties, but if you want to edit the source, then you can directly go and do that. This is just a mock-up right now. This is not the actual designer. Just giving you an idea of what it might look like to be able to switch back and forth and how it integrates directly in. In short, the IWML files in IntraWeb 17 will take the place of the DFM. Otherwise, you will program IntraWeb just the same. Drag and drop, set the properties, set the events, write the Delphi code, press F9 or whichever key you have assigned, and go. So in the current flow in IntraWeb now, the designer updates the DFM file, and then the server, when you deploy, converts the DFM into HTML or CSS, and then it sends that down to the browser. In IntraWeb 17, you can still do that in the legacy mode, or what we call page 16 mode, so your existing code will run just fine. But if you want to start to use the IWML features, you can mix and match these in the same application. The difference is the designer will write to an IWML file, as I just showed you. But instead of translating that into HTML and CSS on the server, instead it will just send down the IWML file to the browser, and the TypeScript library, the IWCL, the IntraWeb component library, will then convert the IWML to HTML and CSS in the browser, and it does this using the DOM rather than strings. So this is a lot faster. It requires a whole lot less CPU, a whole lot less RAM, and even a lot less bandwidth. And it's significant per user, but when you multiply it by hundreds or thousands of users, it really has a huge impact on your server and allows you to use servers with less power to deploy your applications or handle more users on the given server. So a quick review: the DFM is replaced by an IWML file. It's more domain specific, it's more portable. The HTML CSS rendering now occurs in the client instead of the server, providing with simpler code, easier debugging, and significantly reduced server CPU, RAM, and bandwidth load. So the IWML format, the goals were we needed something that was easy to parse, read, and hand edit. We didn't go with XML because it's just way too chatty, and the killer end tags. Now, most of you will probably never have to edit the IWML files directly, just as you do not the DFMs. But as you move into responsive layout, it's actually very handy to be able to switch to the DFM or the IWML in this case, and just cut and paste, especially when you're doing large edits or you're moving code between applications. It's really useful to have that option. Anyone who's worked WPF or XAML knows that the designer is there, but there are some things that are just much better to do by cutting and pasting the text, and it's really, really handy. And the problem with XML is all the end tags have to match. So it would be the equivalent of, in Delphi we have a begin and end, but we just say if, condition, begin, code, end. But in the older versions of Visual Basic, they had typed ends. So they had an end if. So if you had an if, you had to have an end if. If you had a for, you had to have an end for. And XML is the same way. You have to match up all the end tags. And sometimes because of the nesting, the end tag may be hundreds of lines below the beginning tag. And it really gets unmaintainable very, very quick. And each end tag has 3 shifted characters, which is a real annoyance as well when you're typing. So we also tried JSON. And the original IWML files were JSON, but the biggest problem with JSON is JSON was designed to address the chattiness of XML, and they did a fairly good job on that, but it's really limited. It's really tied to how a JavaScript object works, and it can be used with other languages too, but it becomes obvious very quickly that it's basically directly tied to JavaScript objects, and there's a lot of limitations, especially around the subject of arrays or lists of other objects. It does arrays of strings and numbers and symbol types just fine, and it can do objects as well, but it gets really chatty really fast. There's a lot of shifted characters for the beginning braces, end braces, and it sticks quotes everywhere, which when you're coding by hand will just drive you absolutely insane. So in short, it's fairly chatty, especially with the double quotes, but the biggest problem was the limitations, because it's so tied to the JavaScript objects, that when we had to work around the limitations, the workarounds became super, super chatty. And we'll show you an example of this here. IWML is JSON. This is one of the original ones on the left, and that same JSON representation in IWML on the right. And it's not just a matter of compactness, it's not just a matter of using a lot of shift characters. You notice that IWML uses a square brackets because, at least on most keyboards, that's not a shifted character. Now I realize in some other language keyboards or locales it might be, but on most keyboards it's not a shift character. It's also much more compact, but the biggest thing here is it's a whole lot easier to see the blocks and really visually look at it and get an idea what's going on, versus the JSON, which has a lot of empty space and takes up a lot more vertical space as well. And the XML is even bigger than the JSON. The XML is much, much larger. Simple IWML. This we're just going to call this compact. I just removed the spaces, and the next slide I'll show you the spaces. So you can see that this IWML here translates to this screenshot from the browser, and this is actually running, and we're going to show you some demos of this in a minute. If we expand it a little bit, just to make it a little bit easier to read, we've put in spaces. Spaces are valid within JSON. Another example is JSON does not support comments, so if you wanted to comment your code, you were out of luck. It just doesn't have them. In IWML, you can do comments. You can prefix it simply by the pound sign to put comments in your code if you want to notate things, or you want to temporarily disable things for during debugging. So in this case, you can see we have a layout which is called fixed, and there are several layouts. Most of the layouts are responsive. This one's not. This is more the standard IntraWeb or VCL way, where you're saying I want it at this position, and you can specify, but you can see that the top one has a left but not a top, so it goes to 0. All the other layouts are responsive, but this one is a fix, and this is where it says fixed at the top. And then inside the fixed, it has 3 controls, 2 text and a button. And it should be rather self-explanatory what you can see there. Other examples of layouts are, there are several forms of stacks, wraps. We're working in radial panels and several other things out there. If you're familiar with WPF or even some of the stuff in FireMonkey, you should be familiar with some of these layouts. But we're going well beyond the standard layouts to include radial panels and tables and grids and a lot of really interesting things. Let's do a real quick demo on a few of the IWML packages. So this is Visual Studio Code, which is actually what I prefer to use for TypeScript. I talked about this in the other presentation if you want to know why, but this is a free cross-platform IDE for Microsoft, and it supports quite a few languages. It's really popular with a lot of scripting languages, but it can do C# and others as well. So we have an index IWML file here, and this is just a file. The spaces are here just for readability. They don't need to be here. And I've put these in with links to all my other test IWML files. So what I can do is I can debug this. I can just press F5 or I can come over here, and it's set to Firefox right now. And I'm just going to run this, and a browser will pop up in a second. And there we have it. And I'm sorry if the video responds a little bit slowly, but by default the software creates these massive video files, and as I create more and more, they really clog up my hard drive. So I have the video set to a very slow frame rate for the slides, and that may affect the videos as well. So I'll try and move a little bit slowly. If you see things respond very slowly, it's the video, it's not IntraWeb here. It's because I have it set to a very slow, very slow frame rate. So from here I can test different IWML. So for instance, let's look at fixed, which is the one we just looked at. And there's the IWML, which translated into the browser as this. Now IntraWeb, or in this case actually we just sent the IWML file straight down to the browser. So there really isn't the Delphi or the IntraWeb servers here. We just sent the IWML, and the IWCL translated this into HTML and CSS. So if we were to do view page source, it's not going to really show us anything because it's going to show us just the script stuff. If you want to look at it, what you can do is, you can do inspect element, and then you can see the DOM that IWCL actually built up. But none of this was sent down, just the IWML was sent down. And if we look at the IWML, let's close this again, we can come over, and the IWML for fixed was this one here. So there's the IWML again, which produced that. And you might think, okay, that's really simple. What can IntraWeb really do? But even at that point, even though we're very limited, we can do some fairly advanced things. Let me just take you up step by step and show you some of the other things it can do, and then I'll show you the one called Monster, which is pretty much a stress test for IntraWeb currently. Okay, so let's load, for instance, lists. These are all layouts as well. So you can see what's nice about these versus IntraWeb today. If you were to try and produce these, it is possible, but especially with the fixed layout and the anchors that it works with, that's great for applications. When you're trying to do responsive or flow layouts, you end up using templates and it gets a lot uglier. But in this case, the lists are actually a type of layout. So these are all constructed again. So if we come back over to Visual Studio Code and let's look at that one, here's what it looks like. And these ones don't have any names, so they couldn't be modified in code. But if I were to give them names, I could modify them in code, or I could access them dynamically. So it's just like Delphi. On a form or a page, if you don't give something a name, there's no way to access it unless you look it up or iterate it. But if we give it names, then we can directly interact with the code. And we can come over and we can go back and we can look at from other ones. For instance, here's a vertical. Now what we have here is we actually have nested layouts. So we have stacks inside of another stack. A horizontal, or what we call the monster. Now the monster basically tests almost everything. You can see it has layouts inside of layouts. Okay? And these green lines you see here, these are used for debugging. You can turn these on. Most developers would never really need these, but sometimes they can be useful. If you're writing components though, or if you're writing the core like us, these debug borders can really help a lot. So if we want to see the IWML for this one, this is monster. You can see things are nested. So we have layouts inside of layouts. And you can do this pretty much as deep as you want. And this is how you end up with a responsive layout, because instead of using the fixed layout as most people do now, and the fixed layout is still there and of course fully supported, if you want to develop something that looks like a desktop app. But if you're trying to develop something more like a standard web app, you can tell IntraWeb how you want to position rather than exactly where you want to. And then whether it's on a phone or a tablet or a desktop or a 4K monitor, it's able to adjust. And you can also combine this with code or even multiple forms to make it even better. And you can see IntraWeb also there's a blog post about this from a few months ago. IntraWeb, some of the controls have what's called simple markdown, so that you can put things in without having to put in the bold tags. And it's very, very simple. It's only for certain things, but you can see, for instance, that will turn a bold and italic, etc. So that's the monster. Okay, let's close some of the stuff out of the way. And go back to presentation for a second. Let's take a quick look at a simple demo. And again, right now, remember, this is all TypeScript. I know we're all Delphi people or C++ people, and when IntraWeb is farther along, you'll be able to write all of this in Delphi just like you do now. But at the same time, I want to show you that if you want to write something in the browser, how easy it is with IntraWeb 17, especially versus the existing versions of IntraWeb, where you have to mess with not just JavaScript, but you have to work at the DOM level, which is a different level than IntraWeb itself works at. So now you can work at the same level, at a high level, with the IntraWeb component library. So remember, Delphi, 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 just not hooked up to the back end yet. Okay? And there's another cool feature that I'm not going to have time to demonstrate today because it's not ready. But one of the things that's coming in IntraWeb 17 is, in some cases, and it will be it's a narrow set of cases that this can be done. However, these cases are very common and very useful. IntraWeb will be able to translate your Delphi code into TypeScript. And the reason you would want to do this is that, let's say, for example, I have a form that somebody has to fill in, and there's a bunch of fields that either need to be validated, or when the user checks a checkbox or pushes a button or something, other fields change colors or they become visible. So maybe you have like an advanced link, or it could be a checkbox button, and you say, click here for advanced options. And when that happens, you want a whole nother set of controls to show up on the screen that don't exist, or the user can't see. And instead of having to write the Delphi code, instead of it, you clicking that and then it running Delphi on the server and then sending a page back to the client, what will happen is the Delphi code for that will be translated to TypeScript. So when the user presses that button to make all the stuff visible, that'll execute in TypeScript without ever hitting the server. And what this does is this makes the application respond really, really fast to the user, because they're not waiting on it to ask the server what to do and waiting for the results. It's all happening in the browser. But you have the advantage that you get to write the Delphi code, so you don't have to switch over to TypeScript. And it simplifies the debugging as well, because your code is all in one spot there. So here's a simple demo. And you notice we're not using the fixed. I used the fixed earlier just to show you, but in most applications you're not going to. And again, forgive the looks because we haven't worked on the styling, those sorts of things, all functionality. But in this case, we have some IWML, and we have several forms of stacks, but this one's called a simple stack, which just basically puts them on top of each other. So we have an edit, a text, and we have a text block, and that text block is another layout inside the simple stack, and that text block has two text items. And one of them has a name and one of them doesn't, because the one that doesn't, we never need to change it, so we don't need to assign it a name. And then we have a button. So what's cool about this, and this is something that was really hard in the existing versions of IntraWeb, is text blocks. So if I have a block of text that I want to put somewhere, if it doesn't fit, well, I can deal with anchors and stuff, but it won't flow around. This way, the text box, as it grows, the button will move down below however much text we put there. We can put paragraphs and paragraphs of text, and the guest button will just flow. But in addition to that, it is a layout itself. So we can put in bold, we can put in buttons, and we can make these basically, it's like a paragraph. So it's like being able to build your forms in a word processor almost. So you have the best of both worlds. You can do fixed layouts, or you can do these flow types of layouts. So let's take a quick look at what's going on here, and then we'll show you the live demo. So for instance, here's some IWML, which gets a little more complicated. IWML is designed to be very easy to parse and very easy to understand just by reading it. So these top ones here, you can see a space, a colon plus a space means that it's a property. Double square brackets are arrays of objects. And then if I just have a simple colon without a space, that separates the name from the type. So it is very picky about spaces in certain areas, but only in the declarations, not in parameters, etc. And then you can see down here a space where a text guess is, this signifies that this is a parameter, so this is a shorter form of text. I could have spread it out in a longer form, which we'll talk briefly about later. But there are many compact forms of things, so that, for instance, if we had the long form, the minimum size of an object or a class declaration is 3, because you need the type, and then you need, well, generally probably at least one property, and then you need a closing brace. And when you're dealing with dozens or hundreds, that really expands it down. So we built in shortcuts for them. So if you're only setting common properties or just a name, you can do it on one line. And that's what these single lines are. And these ones are single lines because they have a space. A space signifies that a set of parameters comes after them, and the parameters are up to each individual control. So in the example of text or buttons, it's the caption or the text that goes in it. Other controls use different things for their parameters. If you want something that's not specifiable using the parameters, then you have to use a longer form. Let's take a quick look at the demo. So we're going to come back to Visual Studio Code. And what I'm going to do is let's just run it again. So I've pressed F5 to run the application. Now it runs, and just to run it, I'm going to click on Guess. So here's our Guess application. And nothing really earth-breaking here, but let's put in 3. You can see I press Enter, 3 is too low. I can keep guessing 8 is too low. Now, because I do this a lot to test it, I know that it's 5. I have it hard-coded. There's a line when we look at the source, you'll see you can uncomment if you want a really random number, but it's 5. And we can also do things. So for instance, if we type in, it does say that it's not a valid number, but let's put in 5, and you can see we're done, and it deactivates the guess button. Now, what's really interesting here is that if you were to do this in JavaScript today with IntraWeb, you would have to modify the DOM. You couldn't modify the objects directly as you went back to the server. By using the IWCL, we're modifying the class library in the browser very much like we would in Delphi. And we're not messing around with assembly or drawing on canvases or messing with the Windows API equivalents in the browser. We're directly editing the controls. I'm going to show you this. This is a big deal because this makes client-side code so much infinitely easier, thousands of times easier. Anyone who's had to mess directly with the DOM, you're trying to deal with the output from another set of objects and guess what it wants. And if you modify them, sometimes you get in your way, sometimes you can get overwritten, etc. So let's close this and take a look at the code. So for guess, right now I have them all just in different folders. So the IWML is here. It's pretty simple. We took a look at this before. Now what happens is, if I don't have IntraWeb page up here, this is a syntax which tells me that I'm going to have some code behind here. So what happens is IntraWeb will generate a dummy stub file right here. And at runtime, these fields will be set to instances so that you can modify them directly. Just like you can in Delphi right now. When you generate a DFM, it generates an interface section in your pass file. So think of this as the interface section of your Pascal file. And then your code sorry. Let's get back to where we were. Okay. Okay, hit the wrong button. Okay, back. Where did Visual Studio Code go? Okay, bear with me just a second. Okay, that was rather weird. I tried to pause the video for just a second and Visual Studio Code and everything disappeared. That was kind of ugly. Okay, so we're back to normal, I hope. So this is the base class of the interface, and then your code can go here. And again, this is only if you're writing TypeScript. Normally you'd be writing this in Delphi. But just to show you how easy it is, if I want to hook up to the button, for instance, I have a control called button guess. Okay, we saw it over here, it's called button guess. And you can see it in IWML. It's called button guess as well. So to hook it up, the first thing we do is we say event underscore, and then the name, and then the name of the event we want to hook to. And the IWCL, when this runs, will automatically hook this up so that the click event of the button will automatically be tagged to this. And you can see that this is, it even looks pretty similar to Delphi in a lot of ways. So some of you may choose to do a lot more TypeScript when this comes out. And what's cool is that you can debug it directly in here too. And this will work when we get to the Delphi side as well. So for instance, let's run this. Okay, we're going to go to guess again. And let's just put in number. Now you can see we've hit the breakpoint. And once we're in here, you know, we can do all the normal messages. It's undefined yet. But if we were to step through, let's just step through one line at a time. Okay, now message is defined. So we can come in. Oh, it's still null because it hasn't been set. But we can look at the guess. We can see that the user put in 66. And we can check the value of the IWCL object. We're not having to look at the DOM. We're not having to deal with the text box as represented by the DOM, or in complex controls, the individual pieces. We can look at the actual control itself and the values. And what's really cool is when we want to update it, for instance, the text count, instead of trying to find the span or the div or whatever it ends up in the HTML, and instead of trying to find that and having to give it a name or iterate it and set it, we, just like a normal Delphi application, we just take the control and we set its text value. Okay? Now the difference is the properties all have a dot value, and this is because we use special properties which have change detection and several other features in them instead of just standard fields. And we'll talk about this briefly when we get to the control, custom control area. But you can see there's no HTML, there's no direct DOM manipulation. This looks pretty much like standard app development code, but it's running in the browser and it's modifying the DOM for you. So in this case, we want to disable the button. We disable the IWCL button again, and you can see it has different properties, and that will translate into the DOM for you. So we can continue it or stop, whatever. Let's stop. You've already seen what the application does. So we talked about this. This is the interface that it generates, and it just matches up one-to-one to the IWML. And this is something that IntraWeb will generate for you. So if we look at the whole process, we have the IWML here. It generates a DOM for you. IntraWeb auto-generates the interface for you, and then you're free to write your own code around that interface and access all of the named objects. The events are hooked up, as we discussed, by the event underscore prefix, the name of the control, and then the name of the event you want to hook to. These are separated by underscores. Custom controls. Obviously, we need a robust control set, and we're developing a lot of our own controls. And where this is going to be really helpful is the new system is so much easier to write controls, especially complex ones. So you're going to see some really interesting controls come out. And we hope that TMS and Central Guest and the other third parties that are out there will join in as well. There is no way to run the existing controls inside the new framework. You can still run them in IntraWeb 17 using page 16 mode, but if you want to use IWML, you're going to need new controls. The rendering is done in TypeScript, and we've discussed why that is, because all the advantages of being able to render in the browser. Delphi doesn't run in the browser, so it's going to be TypeScript. But this is for custom control users. If you're not writing custom controls, there's no requirement on you to use TypeScript. And then, of course, there's a designer portion which has to be done in Delphi. Let's take a quick look at the Smiley demo. This is a custom control. Let's close a few of the things out. Okay, select files. We have Smiley. So first of all, we have the IWML. We have 3 smileys. And there's actually 3 separate syntaxes here. So this is the long form syntax right here that you can specify the control, all the properties, and then a closing tag. In this case, you'll notice, unlike the other controls, we have sample control dot. This is a namespace because this is a custom control. When you're using the built-in controls, you don't need to specify the namespace because it's in a default namespace. And yes, we'll probably add aliases and default namespaces and those and like. But for now, you specify the namespace and then the control you want. So this is a shortcut because it has a semicolon at the end. That means no parameters but one line. If it sees a space, then it says, okay, I'm looking for parameters, but I'm still one line. So this will set a smiley face with a happy face because the default is true. So this is actually a redundant parameter because the default is true. But in this case, we have it set to false. So if we run this, we'll see, and they're very, very simple controls because I wanted to show you very, very simplistic stuff. There's no graphics or nothing. They're actually just buttons with text in them right now. But they could be full graphics. It could be compound controls. It could be anything else. You can see the first 2 are happy, and the last one is frowny. Now let's take a look at the source code for this real quickly. So to build this custom control, the source code is pretty minimal. Now mind you, this is a minimal control, but this is how easy it is to develop a basic control. Now there's a couple things. This is actually not needed. It just makes the control a little bit easier to develop. So all of our controls have an underscore root, which is of the type of the root element, DOM element that this control uses. And this control, it only has one element. It's not compound. These are the properties. Now TypeScript and JavaScript both have a concept of fields and properties, but we have developed extended properties, because this type of property allows us to do change detection, which is helpful for reducing the bandwidth back and forth to the server. It also has several other features, for instance, hooking up getters and setters if they exist, and typing and a whole bunch of other things. So the basic thing is you just declare a name equals this dot bool prop for a Boolean property. You repeat the name again, and then the default value. And there are string properties and enum properties and others. We need an init method, which every control has to have, where it calls init DOM, and optionally sets its own root if it needs it. And then the render, which just emits the HTML. And again, this one's really, really simple, but other controls are much more complex. Some of the render methods are much, much bigger for the other controls. And then optionally, you have a set parameter. And this allows a short syntax where we pass space true. If you don't support set param, you don't need to. So really what you need to do is these two methods, init and render, are the two methods that every control needs to implement. And that's the basic of a control. And in this case, we just say isHappy, and this is an extended property. So isHappy is the property itself. It's not the value of the property, it's the property. So we can say isTrue, or we could check the value. We could say if value equals true, or if value, but I just found it's clear. I find it's a little bit clearer just to say isTrue in that case. So we say isTrue, and that determines if it's a frowny or a smiley. So again, there's the IWML we talked about briefly. Here's the code again. And the syntax, which I showed you the three forms, the two short forms and the long form. Next question people always ask is, can I beta? No, because it's not to beta phase yet. But you might be able to alpha soon. Right now we're focusing on Team Z, which are kind of like A to Z's MVPs, or the Team B. But if you're really interested and you're a customer that's really active, and if you want alpha with it, then contact us and we'll see what we can do. We definitely need core testers and feedback. We're not looking for someone who just wants to take a small peek. We're looking for people who want to be active and provide suggestions and help us really evolve the product as it moves forward. It's not in a useful state yet. You're not going to build anything very useful. Yes, you can build guest applications, but I don't think any of you are making your bread and butter by selling guest type applications. You could hook it up to other backends. You could even hook it up to a Ruby backend or PHP or Delphi with REST. There are all kinds of things that could be done now, but the controls are pretty limited, but we are working on those in the coming weeks. But if you want to play with it, help us flesh out some early designs, that'd be great. And we're working on what we're going to call an IntraWeb Fiddler, which we'll put online, which will let people play with the IWML live online, press a button and see exactly what it looks like. They won't even need to install anything. So we hope to have that in the coming weeks as well. That's one of the next items we're working on. And that's all I have. Thank you.